Picture a coastline. Southern Africa. 77,000 years ago. The ocean is there, the same ocean, but the world looks nothing like it does today. The sea level is lower. The shoreline extends further into what is now open water. The land is rocky and cold, scoured by wind off the Benguela Current, and along the cliff face there are caves. Small, ancient, facing the sea. In one of them, there is a person. We do not know their name. We do not know if they had a name at all. We know their height, roughly, their build, broadly, upright, our scale, anatomically modern in every measurement that would matter to scientists with caliper. But beyond that, almost nothing. Except this. They are holding a piece of ochre, red ochre, iron-rich stone, ground down on one face to a smooth, flat surface. And they are pressing a pointed tool into it, and they are drawing lines. Not randomly, deliberately. The lines form a pattern, cross-hatched, geometric, parallel lines cut by diagonal ones, nested shapes that repeat with consistency that rules out accident. This took effort. This took sustained, focused intention. This took a mind that held the idea of the pattern before the pattern existed, and then made it real. They are creating something. And here's the question. Not what were they doing? We know what they were doing. What were they thinking? What was happening inside that mind, behind those eyes, while those hands moved across the stone? Because here's the assumption we have lived with for a very long time. We have assumed that to think deeply, to feel complexity, to plan, to grieve, to wonder, to create something that means something, you need language, words, the internal monologue that narrates your life, the ticker tape of syntax running behind everything you do. But this person almost certainly did not have language, not in any form we would recognize, not as we use it now, and yet they were making art. That is the mystery this documentary is about. It is not a mystery about bones or genetics or archaeological dating methods. It is a mystery about consciousness itself, about what it means to be inside a mind, about what the inner experience of being human looked and felt like for the vast, unimaginable stretch of time before the first word was ever spoken. What was it like to be human before language? What exactly were we? Here is a number that most people have heard but never truly felt. 200,000 years. That is roughly how long anatomically modern human beings have existed on this planet. Some researchers push the figure further back. Fossil discoveries in Morocco at a site called Jebel Irhoud have moved the earliest evidence of our species to approximately 300,000 years ago. But let us be conservative. 200,000 years. Now here is another number. 5,000 years. That is approximately how long written language has existed. Cuneiform in ancient Mesopotamia. Hieroglyphics in Egypt. The first phonetic script scratched into clay tablets in cities we can still name. 5,000 years of written human thought. Preserved, recoverable, readable. Hold those two numbers together. 200,000. 5,000. Written language accounts for roughly 2.5% of the total duration of human existence. 2.5%. Everything you have ever read. Every book, every law, every love letter, every sacred text, every history, every story. All of it happened in that narrow sliver at the very end. The remaining 97.5% happened before any of it. Now, this documentary is not really about writing. Writing is just the clearest boundary we can draw. The real question cuts much deeper than that. When did language itself, spoken language, symbolic language, the kind of grammatically structured communication that allows one mind to build complex ideas inside another mind, when did that actually begin? The honest answer is that we do not know. That is not a failure of science. It is a reflection of how genuinely difficult the question is. Language leaves almost no direct physical trace in the fossil record. Vocal cords do not preserve. Brains do not fossilize in any form that tells us about their wiring. The extraordinary neural machinery that makes human speech possible, the precise coordination of breath and larynx and tongue, and the intricate timing of it all, disappears the moment a person dies, sometimes within hours. What we are left with is inference, clues that have to be read obliquely, at angles, through materials and objects and genes that only gesture toward the thing we are actually trying to understand. But those clues are not nothing. They are, in fact, extraordinary. because what they suggest is not a story of emptiness. It is not the story we have told ourselves for generations, of grunting, half-aware creatures slowly stumbling towards something we would recognize as human intelligence. What the evidence actually suggests is a story of minds. Full, rich, emotionally complex, socially sophisticated minds. Minds operating in a cognitive universe so different from ours that we struggle to imagine it, and yet recognizably, undeniably human. Let us try to feel the scale of what we are talking about. Compress the entire history of our species into a single year. January the 1st. Modern humans appear in Africa, probably in the south and east, probably in small, mobile groups following the coasts and rivers. They already have large brains. They already have the anatomy for speech. They already live in complex social groups. The first cave paintings, Lascaux, Chauvet, the great explosion of figurative art in Europe and beyond that most people associate with the dawn of human creativity, those do not appear until around the second week of November. By this scale, the 10th or 11th, depending on which date you use. Agriculture begins around December the 23rd. Writing, December the 30th. The entire recorded history of human civilization, every empire and conquest and revolution, an invention that you were taught in school, fits inside the final day and a half of the human year. The morning of December the 31st to midnight. What happened in the other 363 days? That is a question. And the people who lived through those 363 days were not proto-humans waiting to become real. They were not blank slates, shuffling passively through the dark until language switched the lights on. They were, by every biological measure we have, identical to us. The same brains, the same neocortex, the same prefrontal regions associated with planning and social reasoning and emotional complexity, the same hands, the same eyes. They were us, just in a world and perhaps a mind that was organized around something other than words. And here is where the mystery becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because we have built our entire understanding of intelligence, of creativity, of consciousness around language. When we imagine what it is to think, we imagine words. When we ask what separates humans from other animals, one of our first answers is language. When we try to reconstruct the past, our primary tool is a written record. And when the written record runs out, we tend to assume the inner life runs out with it. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if language did not create the human mind? What if it only changed it? That is one of the most contested and consequential questions in all cognitive science. It sits at the intersection of linguistics, paleoanthropology, neuroscience, and philosophy, and it does not have a settled answer. But in recent decades, the evidence has shifted in a direction that most researchers would not have predicted 50 years ago. The evidence suggests that the pre-linguistic human mind was not impoverished. It was not waiting. It was not primitive in any meaningful sense of that word. It was different, powerful in different ways, rich in different registers. And it was doing things we still cannot fully explain. The story of how we know this begins, as so many human stories do, in Africa, specifically along that rocky southern coastline where the cold and warm currents meet, and where the land is ancient, and the ochre deposits run red to the stone, and where a narrow cave looks out over the Indian Ocean. Blombos Cave. We'll spend time there. We will look at what was left behind in that cave, and what it tells us about the minds that left it. But before we do that, before we examine the evidence, we need to understand the single biggest argument in the science of human prehistory. Not about where humans evolved, not about which species survived or which one extinct, about something far more intimate, about when the first word was spoken, and what the biology of speech can and cannot tell us about that moment. Because it turns out the answer is encoded in our DNA, in a single gene that, when it mutates in the wrong direction, takes away the ability to produce intelligible speech. A gene that researchers spent years believing was uniquely human. A gene that was then found in a slightly different form inside the genome of a species we once believed was entirely unlike us. That gene has a name, FOXP2, and what it tells us about the origin of language will surprise you, because it raises more questions than it answers. And the questions it raises cut right to the heart of everything we think we understand about what it means to think. In a suburb of London, Sometime in the middle of the 20th century, there was a family that could not speak properly. Not all of them, about half. Across 3 generations, grandparents, parents, children, roughly half the members of this family were affected by the same severe and deeply mysterious condition. It moved through the family tree with the clean, predictable regularity of a dominant gene. If one parent was affected, each child had roughly a 50-50 chance. The affected members were not unintelligent. Their hearing was fine. In every other cognitive domain, they functioned broadly normally. But what they could not do, what they struggled to do even with enormous, exhausting effort, was move their mouths and tongues in the rapid, precise, coordinated sequences that speech requires. They could not reliably distinguish between certain similar sounds. They had difficulty with grammatical structures, with tenses, with the rule-governed scaffolding of language. Some had learned to compensate across a lifetime of effort. Others had not. All of them, to varying degrees, existed at the edge of a world they could see but could not fully enter. This family is known in the scientific literature only as the KE family. Their privacy was protected. Their story, however, became one of the most important in the science of human evolution, because in 2001, a team of researchers at Oxford University identified the gene responsible for their condition. They called it FOXP2, and almost nothing about the origin of language would ever look the same again. FOXP2 is what scientists call a transcription factor. Its job is not to build a specific structure directly. It is to switch other genes on and off during development. It is expressed throughout the body. In the brain, yes, but also in the lungs, the heart, the gut, the digestive system. It plays a role in the development of multiple organ systems. It is ancient. Versions of this gene exist in fish, in birds, in mice. It is not a human invention, but in the brain, and specifically in the circuits that control fine motor sequencing. FOXP2 does something that nothing else does in quite the same way. It is a master regulator of the hardware that speech requires. The rapid, millisecond precise movements of tongue and lip and jaw that let you produce intelligible sound. The coordination between breath and voice and articulation that happens so fast and so automatically in a competent speaker that you never notice it at all. All of that runs, in part, on FOXP2. When the KE family gene was disrupted by mutation, the hardware failed. Now here is the critical piece. The human version of FOXP2 differs from the chimpanzee version at exactly 2 positions in the protein it produces. 2 amino acid substitutions in the entire molecule. In the vast machinery of the genome, 3 billion base pairs, tens of thousands of genes, 2 changes. But those 2 changes appear to have made an enormous difference. When researchers introduced a human version of FOXP2 into mice, replacing the mouse version with ours, the mice showed changes in brain circuitry associated with vocal learning and motor sequencing. When bird researchers disrupted FOXP2 function in songbirds, the birds lost the ability to learn their songs normally. The gene does not determine language, but it appears to be part of the foundation on which language is built. And when researchers looked at the genetic variation surrounding those 2 crucial changes in modern human populations, looking across dozens of different ancestries and geographies, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. There was almost no variation. The region of the genome around those 2 changes was nearly identical everywhere they looked. No matter where the people came from, Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas, the sequence around the key positions was essentially the same. In genetics, that pattern has a name. It is called selective sweep. And what it means is this. At some point in the past, those 2 changes conferred such an overwhelming advantage that they spread to the entire human population with extraordinary speed, erasing the genetic diversity that had existed before. The earlier variants were simply outcompete, replaced, swept away. Something had happened, something involving FOXP2, something that gave the people who had the new version such a profound advantage that within a geologically brief span of time, every living human carried it. This was a discovery that made headlines. The language gene, the 2 mutations that made us human, the genetic moment when the lights came on. Except, in 2007, a team of researchers analyzed ancient DNA extracted from Neanderthal fossils found a cave in northern Spain called El Sidron. They were examining multiple genes, looking for clues about how similar or different Neanderthals were from us at the molecular level. And when they looked at FOXP2, they found the same 2 human amino acid changes. Not a chimpanzee-like version. Not an intermediate form. Not something close. The same variants. The same positions. Let that settle for a moment. Neanderthals diverged from the lineage leading to modern humans somewhere between 400,000 and 800,000 years ago, depending on which analysis you trust. They were not our direct ancestors. They were our cousins, a parallel branch of the human family that evolved separately across Europe and Western Asia, while our own lineage was evolving in Africa. Parallel, distinct, a different species by most definitions. And they had the same FOXP2. The field erupted. The debate began immediately and has not fully resolved. Either the 2 human-specific changes arose in the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans, before the lineages diverged, meaning both branches inherited it from the same ancient source. Or the changes spread from modern humans into the Neanderthal population through interbreeding, which we now know beyond any doubt occurred. Neanderthal DNA is detectable in the genomes of virtually all living people with ancestry outside of sub-Saharan Africa. The genetic timing is genuinely contested, and newer analyses of the region around FOXP2 have made the picture more complicated still, not less. But either way, the implication is the same. Neanderthals had the genetic hardware for speech. Not necessarily the identical speech. Not necessarily the same complexity. But the molecular architecture that in modern humans underlies fine oral motor control. They had it. And FOXP2 was not the only line of evidence pointing in this direction. There is the hyoid bone, a small, curved bone in the throat, shaped roughly like a horseshoe, that sits above the larynx and anchors the muscles of the tongue. It is rarely preserved in the fossil record, too delicate, too loosely attached. But excavators at a Neanderthal burial site in Israel, at a cave called Cabra, found one, and when researchers compared it to the human hyoid, the resemblance was striking. The shape, the internal structure, the musculature it would have supported, essentially the same. There's the larynx position. Modern humans are unusual among primates. Our larynx sits lower in the throat than it does in chimpanzees or gorillas, and that descended position dramatically expands the range of sounds we can produce. It opens up the full vowel space of human language. It is also, incidentally, why humans can choke on food in a way most other primates cannot. We traded a safety feature for the sound space that language demands. Analyses of Neanderthal skull-base anatomy suggest they too had a descended larynx. So here we have a species with the human form of FOXP2, a hyoid shaped like ours, a larynx position like ours, a brain shaped differently, elongated where ours is globular, but roughly equivalent in volume, larger than ours in some individuals. The hardware was there, and yet, this is a wall that paleogenetics keeps running into, and it is a wall worth understanding, because it is the same wall we will encounter again and again throughout this story. Biology is not destiny. Hardware is not software. Having the anatomy for speech does not mean you are speaking. Having the gene that enables fine oral motor coordination does not mean you have language. Language is not a gene. It is not a bone or a brain structure you can point to in a fossil. It is a cultural technology, one that almost certainly accumulated over vast stretches of time, built up incrementally and passed down across generations, as dependent on social transmission as on any biological substrate. You could have every gene in place, every anatomical structure correctly formed, and still not have language, if the cultural scaffold had not yet been built. If the evolutionary and social pressures that drive at elaboration had not yet compounded to the tipping point, if no one around you had yet developed the conventions, the symbols, the shared agreements about what sounds mean what things. Think of it this way. Your newborn child has all the genetic hardware for language. FOXP2 intact, larynx descended, hyoid present, brain enormous relative to body size. But without the cultural immersion, without language flowing at them from the moment of birth, they will not develop language. Not in any complete form. The hardware requires the software, and the software is transmitted, not grown. FLXB2 tells us when a crucial piece of biological scaffolding became fixed in our lineage, and apparently in our cousins. It does not and cannot tell us when language began, because language is not reducible to that scaffolding, however necessary the scaffolding might be. And so the question remains open. Were those minds, the ones carrying the right gene, with the right hyoid, the right larynx, the brain large enough to run the most complex social cognition on the planet, were they already operating in a symbolic register? Already using objects to mean other things? Already reaching, in some wordless way, toward a function that language would eventually serve? Genetics cannot answer that, but objects can. Or at least, objects can get us closer than any gene sequence. And it turns out that the objects left behind by the early human world are more extraordinary than almost anyone expected. Not for what they obviously represent, but for what they quietly, stubbornly refuse to reveal. For what they suggest about minds that were clearly reaching towards something, creating something, meaning something, in a world that may not yet have had the words to say what. The most remarkable of those objects is waiting for us in a cave on a cold and rocky stretch of the South African coast. It is a flat piece of stone, smaller than your hand, and on one surface, scratched with a pointed tool by a deliberate and patient intelligence, there's a pattern of lines that no one alive today can fully explain. 77,000 years of silence, and a question that will not go away. The cave is not impressive from the outside. It is a small opening in a limestone cliff, about 15 meters above the present shoreline, on a stretch of the South African coast that is windswept and beautiful and extremely remote, 300 kilometers east of Cape Town, where the Cape Fold Mountains push against the sea and the vegetation is low and tough, and the light in the afternoon hours comes off the water an angle that makes everything look older than it is. For most of the 20th century, the cave was simply there, known to locals, unexplored by archaeologists. The cliff face held it like a secret it wasn't sure it wanted to share. Then in the 1980s, a South African archaeologist named Christopher Henshelwood began paying attention to it. Excavations began in the 1990s. And what came out of that cave over the following decades rewrote, and is still rewriting, our understanding of how early the human mind achieved something that we had assumed took much, much longer. The cave had been occupied intermittently. People came and went across tens of thousands of years, staying during periods when the climate made the coastal resources particularly rich, shellfish, fish, seals, plant foods along the shore, and abandoning it during harsher periods when the sea retreated or the land became less hospitable. It was a campsite, a shelter, a kitchen. The middens, the garbage heaps, are full of shellfish and animal bone. But buried in the sediments, along with the food remains and the stone tools and the charcoal of ancient fires, were other things. Things that were not food. Things that were not tools in any purely functional sense. Things that make no sense unless you accept something about the people who left them. Let us start with the beads. Necerius crowsinus, a small marine snail, common along the southern African coast. The shells are roughly the size of a grain of rice. Small, oval, tan and brown, and sometimes faintly iridescent. At Blombos, researchers found these shells in the archaeological layers. Dozens of them, dated to approximately 75,000 years ago. But they were not food shells. The snails that live in those shells are too small to eat in any meaningful quantity. They had not been discarded after a meal. They had been deliberately collected, deliberately perforated, deliberately worked. And many of them were stained with ochre. They were beads, worn on a string, worn around a wrist or neck. We cannot know exactly how, but the patterns aware on the perforations, the consistency of the ochre coating, and the fact that the shells found together share a very similar size, as though someone had selected them carefully, matched them, all of this points in one direction only. Someone made jewelry. 75,000 years ago, on this coastal shelf, a human being looked at a pile of tiny shells and thought, I want to wear these. I want to mark myself with them. I want to be seen wearing them. That single act, the act of ornamentation, is not trivial. It is not a small thing. Body ornamentation is a fundamentally symbolic behavior. It says, I have an image of myself as others see me. I can project a signal about who I am, what group I belong to, what status I hold, what identity I carry. I understand that the shell means something beyond its physical properties. And I understand that other people will read that meaning. That is an extraordinarily complex cognitive act. It requires what psychologists call theory of mind, the capacity to model another person's perspective, to understand that other beings have inner states different from your own, and to manipulate those inner states by controlling what they see. The beads are a social technology as much as they are objects, but they were not alone in the sediments. In the same layers and in layers below them, dated to approximately 100,000 years ago, excavators found something that stopped the scientific community even more completely. Abalone shells. Large, smooth, bowl-shaped, but not food debris. Inside several of them, researchers found the remnants of a compound material, a mixture, ochre, rich red iron oxide, ground to a fine powder and combined with crushed bone, charcoal, and what appears to have been a liquid binder, possibly animal fat or plant oils, mixed together into a stable, paste-like compound. This was a recipe, an ochre toolkit, not just ochre by itself, would have been used by human ancestors for at least 200,000 years, possibly longer, though often without clear evidence of symbolic intent. This was ochre deliberately combined with other materials to produce a specific result. The abalone shells functioned as containers. The grinding stones found nearby showed traces of the same compounds. The operation had a sequence. Gather the ochre, grind it, add the bone, also ground separately, add the charcoal, mix with the binder, store. 100,000 years ago, the researchers who analyzed this toolkit published their findings in Science magazine, and the reception in the archaeological community was immediate and electric. Because the production of a compound, a multi-ingredient material with properties different from any of its components, requires a specific kind of thinking. It requires understanding that combining things changes them. It requires holding a sequence of steps in mind. It requires working toward a result that does not yet exist, guided by a mental model of what the process will produce. It requires, in other words, something very close to what we would call planning, abstraction, intentional causation. And then there's the engraving, in a layer dated to approximately 77,000 years ago, not the oldest material at Blombos, but among the most arresting. Excavators found a piece of ochre, slightly larger than a matchbox, flat on one face where it had been deliberately ground smooth, and on that smooth face, someone had used a pointed stone tool to draw lines. The pattern is geometric. A row of diagonal parallel lines runs across the middle. Crosshatched lines run through them. The overall form has a quality of structure, of repetition that implies a rule, a system, an intention behind the geometry rather than mere decoration. It is not a picture of anything, not a hand, not an animal, not a face. It is pure pattern. And that is exactly what makes it so difficult, because here is where the debate begins. Here is where archaeologists who agree on the facts completely diverge on what those facts mean. On one side, researchers like Francesco D'Erico, one of the most rigorous voices in the field, argue that the Blombos engraving, alongside the beads and the toolkits, constitutes clear evidence of what they call modern symbolic behavior. Behavior mediated by symbols. Behavior that requires and expresses a mind capable of letting objects stand for things other than themselves. In D'Erico's view, the case for early modern cognition does not need to wait for the cave paintings of Europe 40,000 years later. It is already here, in this cave, in these objects, 77,000 years ago. On the other side, other researchers urge caution, not because they doubt the antiquity or the authenticity of the objects, those are established, but because of a more fundamental question. What exactly is a symbol? A symbol is not just a made object. It is not just a pattern. A symbol is a sign that a community of minds has agreed carries a specific meaning, a meaning that is conventional, shared, and stable enough to function as a form of communication or cognition across people and across time. The shell bead means something, but for it to mean something in the full symbolic sense, the meaning has to be shared. There has to be an agreement, even an implicit one, between the person wearing it and the person seeing it about what it signifies. And here's the problem. The ochre engraving is not labeled. No caption survives. No context tells us what the geometric pattern represented to the person who made it, or whether it represented anything at all in the linguistic sense of that word. It could be symbolic, a marking of identity, a record, a cosmological sign, a territorial signal. It could be something simpler and stranger, a product of a kind of compulsive making that is its own end, that does not require external reference to justify itself. It could be something in between, in a category for which we do not yet have a word, because our categories were built by and for minds that already had language. The objects at Blombos are extraordinary, but they are also profoundly, deliberately silent on the very question we most want them to answer. Were the people who made them thinking in symbols? Yes, almost certainly, in some sense of that phrase. Were they thinking in words? We cannot know. Were they using a shared sign system that approached the functionality of language? Possibly. Were they conscious in the way we use that word? That is a question we will have to earn our way towards slowly, because it is the hardest question of all. But there is one more thing the cave offers, and it may be the most remarkable detail of everything found there. The stone tools at Blombos are made from a material called silkrete, and silkrete in its natural state is not ideal for knapping, for the careful, controlled fracturing that produces a sharp, reliable blade. It is too unpredictable, too coarse in its internal structure. But heat-treated silkrete is different. Heat the stone slowly to a high and specific temperature over many hours, then cool it slowly, and its internal structure changes at the molecular level. It becomes finer, more glassy, more predictable under the knapper's hand, far better for making precise, thin, sharp tools. The people at Blombos were heat-treating their silkrete, and they were doing before the tool was made, building fires, placing stone in them, managing temperature across many hours, and then later, when the stone had cooled and transformed, using that transformed stone to make their tools. They were preparing for a future that had not yet arrived. They were changing the present on behalf of something they could only imagine. That is not an animal behavior. That is not instinct or conditioning or a simple learner response. That is planning across time, holding an imagined future in mind, and taking real actions now to bring it closer. And it was happening here, in this cave, 77,000 years ago, by a mind we do not fully understand, in a world without, or with only the earliest, most tentative forms of the language we now take for granted as a medium of all thought. Which brings us to a question that the cave alone cannot answer. Because during all of this, during this entire period when the people at Blombos were making beads and grinding ochre and heating stone in carefully managed fires, there was another human species on Earth, not a primitive ancestor, not a distant cousin so remote as to be unrecognizable, a species with large brains and strong hands and the genetic hardware for speech, a species that buried its dead, that made tools of great sophistication, that appears in its own record, to have done things that look disturbingly, uncomfortably like what the people at Blombos were doing. A species we spent most of modern history dismissing as inferior, brutish, cognitively limited. A species we now know we were wrong about, in ways that are still, even now, difficult to absorb. In 1908, in a village in southwestern France called La Chapelle-aux-Saints, two priests made a discovery that would define the way the world understood our closest relatives for almost a century. In a small hollow in the floor of a limestone cave, they found a skeleton. Old, male, nearly complete, buried deliberately, in a scooped-out depression in the rock, surrounded by animal bones and stone tools, and the traces of what appeared to be intentional placement. It was a Neanderthal. The skeleton was handed to a French paleontologist named Marcelin Boule, and Boule spent 3 years studying it before publishing his analysis. His reconstruction was meticulous, and it was catastrophically wrong. Boule described the Neanderthal as stooped, bent-kneed, head thrust forward, spine curved like an ape's, feet flat and splayed, incapable of the fully upright gait of modern humans. He described the brain as large but primitive, lacking the frontal development associated with higher thought, driven by sensation and reflex rather than reason. He drew, in essence, a brute, a half-human shuffling through a savage world, lacking the inner life that distinguished true humanity. What Boule had actually studied, as researchers discovered decades later, was a skeleton of an elderly male with severe osteoarthritis that had deformed his spine and joints. The stooped posture was disease, not anatomy. The splayed feet were pathology, not primitive locomotion. A healthy Neanderthal walked exactly as we do. Boole's reconstruction entered textbooks and encyclopedias and the popular imagination and lodged there for generations. The image became a shorthand. The word itself became an insult. By the time science caught up with the actual evidence, the cultural damage was essentially permanent. We had decided, before the evidence was in, what Neanderthals were, and then, for 70 years, we read the evidence through that decision. What the evidence actually shows is something stranger and more unsettling than any brute. Begin with the basics. Neanderthals evolved in Europe and Western Asia across a period of at least 200,000 years, perhaps more. They lived through multiple ice ages, adapting to climates of extraordinary harshness, hunting large and dangerous game across glacial steppe and boreal forest and mountain terrain. They made tools of genuine sophistication. The Mysterian technology, named for a site in France, produced carefully shaped stone points and scrapers and blades that required planning and skill to manufacture. They cared for their sick and injured. The La Chapelle skeleton itself, with its severe arthritis and missing teeth, had survived long enough for those conditions to become chronic, which means someone was feeding him, sheltering him, keeping him alive through incapacity. They were not alone in their own darkness. They had each other. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. Let that land for a moment. Not smaller, larger. Roughly 1,500 cubic centimeters against our average of approximately 1,350. The raw volume is not everything. A sperm whale has a brain 6 times the size of ours and does not appear to be writing poetry, but it is not nothing. These were not small-brained creatures. These were not cognitively impoverished beings surviving on instinct, but the shape mattered. Neanderthal skulls are elongated, low, wide, built more from back to front. Their occipital lobes at the rear are relatively large, associated with visual processing. Their parietal lobes at the top and sides are relatively smaller than ours. The parietal regions in modern humans are associated with numerical cognition, with integrating information across different sensory domains, with certain aspects of language and symbolic reasoning. What that difference in brain shape actually meant for inner experience, no one can say with confidence, but it almost certainly meant something. 2 different cognitive architectures. 2 different ways of processing the same world. And yet, in Croatia, at a site called Krpina, excavators found something in Neanderthal, layers dated to approximately 130,000 years ago. 8 talons from white-tailed eagles. Large, curved, powerful claws, the kind of claws that rip through flesh. But these had not been discarded as food waste. They showed cut marks consistent with careful, deliberate removal from the bird. They showed polishing, the kind of smooth surface that comes from extended contact with skin or being repeatedly handled and worn. And they were sized to fit together, to be strung. 130,000 years ago, 8 eagle talons, worn as jewelry by Neanderthals who lived and died in what is now Central Europe, before modern humans were anywhere near that continent. The timing is everything here, and it is the argument that has shifted the debate most dramatically. Because for decades, researchers who were willing to accept that Neanderthals engaged in symbolic behavior would immediately face a counter-argument. Perhaps they were copying modern humans. Perhaps the shell beads and the pigments and the ornaments in Neanderthal sites were not independently invented. Perhaps they were imitated from the modern humans moving into Europe, absorbed through contact and trade. The so-called acculturation hypothesis. Neanderthals as cultural magpies, adopting behaviors they did not fully understand from people who were cognitively superior. The Krpina talons dismantle that argument completely. 130,000 years ago, there were no modern humans in Europe. Our species was still in Africa, still developing, still tens of thousands of years from a migration that would eventually bring us into Neanderthal territory. Whatever the people at Krpina were doing with those eagle talons, they were not copying us. They arrived there on their own. Then there are the caves in Spain. At 3 sites, La Paisiega, Maltreviso, and Ardales, cave art has been known for decades. geometric signs, painted hands, red and black pigment on limestone walls. For most of that time, they were attributed to modern humans. Then in 2018, a team of researchers published uranium-thorium dating of the mineral crust that had formed over the paintings, crusts that had grown on top of the art and were therefore younger than it. And the dates came back at 65,000 years ago, or older. At one panel in Ardales, the date exceeded 80,000 years. Modern humans did not arrive in Europe until roughly 45,000 years ago. The art was already there, if the dating is accurate, and it has been contested by other researchers who question methodology. Then Neanderthals were making cave art, not copying a technique, not participating in a tradition someone else started, inventing it, putting pigment on stone walls in darkness tens of thousands of years before our species set foot on that continent. And there's the pigment itself. At multiple Neanderthal sites across Europe, researchers have found manganese dioxide, a black mineral used as a colorant, in quantities and contexts suggesting deliberate collection and use. At Pech de LA's in France, Neanderthals were collecting and perhaps grinding manganese dioxide at least 50,000 years ago. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, shells containing traces of red and yellow pigment, ochre have been uranium-thorium dated to approximately 115,000 years ago. Red and yellow pigments in shells, stored or prepared 115,000 years ago, before us, before our arrival, before any possible imitation. The picture that assembles from all of this is not the creature of Boole's imagination. It is not an ape-man stumbling through the dark. It is something more complicated and more troubling. A being with a biological hardware for language, with a large and complex brain, with demonstrable symbolic behavior, with social bonds strong enough to sustain care for the sick and deliberate burial of the dead. A being with, in all probability, some form of inner life. But here is where the story becomes painful. Roughly 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappeared. The last populations appear to have held on longest in the most remote corners of their former range. In Gibraltar, perhaps at caves on the rock that overlooked the Mediterranean, where the climate was milder and the resources sufficient. But even there, the record goes silent. The tools stop appearing. The fires go cold. The last Neanderthal, somewhere at some point in some shelter or on some hillside, died without descendants who survived. An entire way of being human, extinguished. The timing is not coincidental. Modern humans moved into Europe. Neanderthals vanished. The overlap lasted somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 years, depending on the region and the dating method. And then they were gone. What happened in those years of overlap is one of the most contested questions in all of paleoanthropology. Direct violence? Probably some. Competition for resources? Almost certainly. Disease introduction from populations with different immune histories? Very likely. But researchers who have studied the population dynamics closely suggest that competition alone, even without overt conflict, would have been sufficient. Modern humans were expanding. Neanderthal populations were already small and fragmented. A slight difference in reproductive rate or infant mortality, compounded across centuries, is enough. Slow displacement, not a war, a tide. And we know, because the genome tells us directly, that in those years of coexistence, the two populations were not always strangers. They met, they intermixed. Children were born of those encounters, and some of those children had descendants who survived and whose lineage persists today. Every person on Earth with ancestry outside of sub-Saharan Africa carries approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. The immune genes we carry, some of the genetic variants that shape our disease resistance and our biology, came from them. They are not entirely gone. They are inside us, which makes their extinction stranger to contemplate, not simpler. Because whatever was that allowed modern humans to displace them, and the most compelling theories center on some advantage in communication, in cultural transmission, in the ability to share complex information and coordinate at larger scales. That advantage was not a difference between a smart species and a stupid one. It was a difference between two intelligent, symbolic, socially complex species, one of which apparently had some edge that the other did not. And the most likely candidate for that edge is the one thing that leaves the least trace in the fossil record. Language. Not necessarily its presence or absence. We cannot say Neanderthals had no communication, no symbolic vocalizations, nothing approaching a shared sign system. The evidence makes that increasingly implausible. What we can say is that something in the way modern humans transmitted information, accumulated it, stored it, spread it across larger networks, built on it across generations with fidelity and a speed that Neanderthal culture did not match. Something about that system was different, more powerful, more cumulative, a ratchet where there may have been a wheel. But this only sharpens the central question. Because if Neanderthals were symbolic, were social, were emotionally complex, if they made jewelry and painted caves and buried their dead and cared for their sick, then what was the nature of their inner experience? Were they conscious of themselves? Did they grieve the dead they buried? Did they feel pride in the eagle talons they wore? We cannot answer those questions for Neanderthals. We struggle to answer them even for the modern humans of the same period. But to understand what consciousness without language might have felt like, what thought looked like, what planning and coordinating and teaching and creating looked like before syntax organized it all, we have to look not at the bones or the genes or the painted walls. We have to look at the tools. Because the way these ancient minds made tools, the way they learned to make them, the way they taught others to make them, the way that knowledge moved across generations in geography without a word being written and perhaps without a word being spoken in any form we would recognize, tells us something astonishing about what the pre-linguistic mind was actually capable of, something that should force us to rethink almost everything we believe about the relationship between language and intelligence. Something that begins not with symbol or a painting or an ornament, but with a stone and a pair of hands, and a mind that knew exactly what it was doing. Pick up a hand axe. If you have never held one, close your eyes and imagine it, slightly larger than your palm, teardrop-shaped, symmetric on both faces, with a worked edge running continuously around the entire perimeter. The stone is gray flint or quartzite or volcanic obsidian, whatever the maker had access to, and its surface is covered in shallow, overlapping scars. Each scar is a trace of a deliberate blow, a precise application of force at a precise angle, applied at exactly the right point, anticipating how the stone will fracture along its internal grain, adjusting for what came before, preparing for what must come next. Every scar is a decision. The oldest hand axes are approximately 1,700,000 years old. Made by Homo erectus in Africa, they spread, along with the species, across enormous territories, eventually appearing in sites from the southern tip of Africa to Spain to the Indonesian archipelago. One basic form, one recognizable tradition, traceable across a span of time and geography so vast it is almost impossible to conceptualize. And here is the first mystery of this chapter. For most of that 1,700,000 years, the hand axe barely changed. The same basic shape, the same general technique, across continents, across climate shifts that remade the landscape of entire regions, across hundreds of thousands of years during which the human brain was measurably evolving, the body was changing, the species itself was transforming beneath the pressure of selection, and the hand axe, the object, the technology, the embodied knowledge, remain almost perfectly stable. We will come back to what that means, because it is not the obvious answer. But first, what does it actually take to make one? Thomas Wynne is an archaeologist who has spent decades studying the cognitive implications of stone tool manufacture. He has learned to nap himself. He has analyzed what the process demands in terms of working memory, spatial reasoning, and executive planning. And his conclusion is worth sitting with carefully. Making an Acheulean hand axe requires what cognitive scientists call hierarchical action planning, the capacity to hold a goal in mind while executing a long and ordered sequence of sub-goals, each of which must be completed before the next becomes accessible. You begin with a raw nodule of stone. In your mind, before the first blow, you can already see the finished tool, not the stone as it is, but as it will be when you are done. You work backwards from that mental image, removing material in a sequence that is not arbitrary, that cannot be arbitrary, because each blow shapes a platform for the next blow, and a mistake in the middle cannot be corrected. It can only be accommodated, or it ends the piece entirely. You are not just hitting a rock. You are navigating a branching decision tree in three-dimensional space, under physical pressure, with irreversible consequences for every error, guided entirely by a mental image of an object that does not yet exist. Cognitive researchers estimate that the working memory demands and spatial reasoning required for this operation are not substantially different from those of modern human uses when performing complex planning tasks today. The brain running the process may have been different in certain respects, but the cognitive load was real and it was high. It was managed generation after generation across 1,700,000 years in beings who almost certainly had no language in any form we would recognize. Now, carry that forward. By roughly 300,000 years ago, in the period when Neanderthals were fully established in Europe and early modern humans were emerging in Africa, stone tool technology had evolved into something even more cognitively demanding. Something that, when you understand how it works, stops being impressive and starts being astonishing. It is called the Levallois technique. Named for a suburb of Paris where distinctive stone cores were identified by researchers in the 19th century. In the Levallois method, the toolmaker does not shape the tool directly from the nodule. Instead, they prepare the nodule first, working its exterior through a careful series of preliminary removals, sculpting the surface so that it becomes a shaped platform for which a final flake can be struck. When that final blow is delivered, the flake that detaches is not random. It is predetermined. It has a specific shape, the shape the maker intended at the very beginning of the entire process. The finished tool is conceptually complete before the first preparatory flake is removed. The entire preparatory operation exists in service of an object that will not exist until everything else is done. Researchers who have learned to do this reliably report that it takes years of dedicated practice. Not months. Years. And the learning does not come primarily through explanation. A verbal description of the Levallois method cannot substitute for watching it done, again and again, at close range, until the hands begin to understand what the words cannot convey. Because the knowledge is not primarily verbal. It is spatial and tactile and kinesthetic. It lives as much in the hands as in the mind, and the hands learn it differently than the mind learns anything that can be put into language. Which brings us to the question at the heart of this chapter. How did this knowledge pass from generation to generation? Not through writing, not through diagrams, not through verbal instructions, at least not primarily. It passed away. Fundamental human knowledge has always moved when language is absent or insufficient, through presence, through watching, through a quality of sustained, embodied attention that is more demanding in certain ways than listening. Cognitive scientists call this observational learning, embodied apprenticeship, and modern research on it reveals something that cuts against a deep assumption. The assumption that without language, complex knowledge cannot be reliably transmitted across generations. It can. What it requires is more demanding than words. It requires sustained physical proximity. The learner must be near the teacher across hundreds of hours, watching not just the outcome of the process, but the process itself. The grip, the angle of approach, the quality of attention the teacher brings to each decision, the micro-adjustments made before a blow is struck, the way a good napper holds the work still and reads the stone before committing. The teacher need not explain. The teacher need not name. The teacher need only do, and do it where it can be watched, and do it again and do it again. Researchers studying traditional craft transmission in living communities describe this process with a phrase that has entered cognitive science as a technical term. Learning by doing alongside, not being told, not even being shown in the demonstrative sense, being embedded in the practice long enough and deeply enough that the knowledge arrives not through instruction, but through immersion. Now return to the puzzle we set aside. The hand axe that barely changed for 1,700,000 years. The obvious interpretation is cognitive limitation. Minds not sophisticated enough to innovate. Beings trapped in a tradition they cannot move beyond. But some researchers offer a very different reading, and it is worth taking seriously. Without language, cumulative cultural evolution, the kind where one person's insight is verbally communicated, remembered, built upon, and improved by people who were not there, is enormously difficult. Each generation must relearn largely from what it can directly observe. Innovation can occur, but it is hard to preserve, hard to spread, hard to make permanent across geography and time. The ratchet of cultural accumulation clicks forward, but slowly. And so traditions persist, not because the makers lack the capacity for variation, but because variation, without language to carry it, has a difficult time surviving the death of the individual who generated it. Look closely at the Acheulean record, though, and it is not entirely static. There are regional variations. There are adaptations to local materials. There are refinements. The tradition did evolve, just on a time scale that makes everything in recorded human history look like a weekend project. 1,700,000 years. And across all of that time, the knowledge was kept alive, not in libraries, not in archives, not in any external storage at all. In hands, in the patient, wordless transmission of one generation watching another, in shelters and beside rivers, in a continuity of practice that is its own kind of miracle. But the tool traditions, as extraordinary as they are, represent only one dimension of what prelinguistic cognition was managing. Think for a moment about what a member of a mobile hunter-gatherer band would need to hold inside their mind just to survive from one season to the next. Hundreds of plant species, which are edible raw, which require cooking to neutralize toxins, which have medicinal properties, and for which conditions, which are seasonal, and when their seasons shift with rainfall, which indicate the presence of water nearby, which signal specific soil types that also indicate other resources. Dozens of animal species, their seasonal migrations, their threat behaviors, their watering schedules, the signs they leave in mud and vegetation at different intervals of time, the sound they make at different distances, and in different states of alarm, the geography of a home range spanning hundreds of square kilometers, every reliable water source, every seasonal resource, every shelter site, every dangerous terrain feature, navigated without a map, without written landmarks, without any external record at all, held in biological memory, updated constantly by experience, and transmitted entirely through observation and presence, and whatever forms of communication existed in that world. This is not an impoverished mind. This is not a mind waiting to be switched on by language. This is a mind running at full capacity in a domain where survival demands it. A mind carrying a library that has no building, no catalog, no written entries. A library that exists only as long as the people who hold it are alive, and that must be continually, painstakingly transferred to the next generation before it dies with its keepers. Modern cognitive science draws a distinction that illuminates everything we have been circling. There are, broadly, two kinds of knowledge. Declarative knowledge, knowing that. Facts, propositions, names, dates, the content of sentences. The kind of knowledge that can be stated, written down, transmitted in language, and procedural knowledge, knowing how. Skills, habits, bodily competencies, the deeply embedded knowledge of practice, the kind of knowledge that lives below language, that operated long before language existed, and that continues to operate independently of it even now. These two systems run on different neural architecture. They can be dissociated by brain injury. There are patients who retain flawless procedural skill while losing all access to declarative memory. There are patients with the reverse profile who can tell you everything about a procedure they can no longer physically perform. The systems are real. They are distinct. And their distinctness matters enormously for understanding what was happening in prelinguistic minds. Procedural knowledge does not require language. It predates language by an enormous margin. In evolutionary time and in individual human development, a child learns to walk long before they can say the word. A master craftsperson's hands outrun their own ability to describe what they are doing in states of deep absorption. What researchers now call flow, the verbal layer of consciousness grows quiet, and performance often improves. Athletes and musicians and surgeons report this. The chatter stops, and the body, running on procedural knowledge accumulated across thousands of hours of practice, does things a conscious verbal mind could never have coordinated in real time. Prelinguistic human minds were running procedural knowledge at extraordinary levels of sophistication. The tool traditions, the ecological memory, the navigation of complex social landscapes, all of it procedural, embodied, wordless, and demonstrably, verifiably powerful. Language did not create this. Language arrived later. into a mind that was already extraordinary, and it changed what was possible in ways we are still mapping. But the foundation was not empty. The intelligence was not waiting for permission to begin. The capacity for planning, for social complexity, for accumulated tradition and transmitted knowledge, all of it was already there, running on different hardware, in a different register, oriented toward different kinds of knowing, before the word. And that raises the next question, the one that the tools and the ecological memory and the procedural knowledge all point toward but cannot by themselves answer. How did all of this individual capability coordinate? How did 50 or 100 of these wordless, capable, emotionally complex minds organize themselves into a functioning group? How did they divide labor, manage conflict, plan expeditions, maintain the social fabric that kept the group coherent over time? Because the social architecture of the prelinguistic world, the way minds without language found each other and built something larger than any single mind to contain, is where the evidence becomes most surprising of all. And it begins not with tools and not with art and not with genetics. It begins with something we almost never think of as a cognitive technology at all. Something ancient enough to predate our species by millions of years. Something that has been with us in the firelight and the darkness since before we had any word for what it was doing to us. It is rhythm. That is what the tease was pointing toward. Not language, not art, not tools. Something older than all of them. Here is something that seems almost too simple to matter until you follow it to where it leads. Put two people in a room long enough and their bodies will begin to synchronize. Breathing rates, blinking patterns, micro movements of posture and gesture. The convergence is not deliberate. It is not conscious. It happens below the level of intention, in a neural system so ancient that it predates our species by millions of years. The technical term is entrainment, the tendency of biological rhythms to lock onto each other when beings are in proximity and in communication. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, show almost none of this. They do not spontaneously synchronize their movements to a shared beat. When researchers expose chimpanzees to rhythmic stimulation, they do not entrain to it the way humans do. The capacity is not simply less developed in them. It is qualitatively different. Humans, on the other hand, entrain compulsively, effortlessly. Babies barely old enough to sit upright will bounce rhythmically in response to music. Toddlers synchronize their walking pace to a companion without being asked. Put two strangers across a table in conversation, and within minutes their postures will mirror each other. Their speech rates will converge. Their emotional states will bleed across the gap between them in ways neither can fully perceive or control. We are, at a very deep level, built to resonate with each other. And in a world without language, or with only its earliest, most tentative approximation, that resonance was not a peripheral feature of human social life. It was the architecture. It was the infrastructure on which everything else was built. To understand why, we need to sit with a number, 150. That is a figure associated with the British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who has spent decades studying the relationship between brain size and social group size across primate species. His observation is straightforward. The larger the neocortex of a primate species relative to the rest of its brain, the larger the stable social groups that species maintains. The correlation is consistent across dozens of species. And when you extrapolate the relationship to the human neocortex, the largest of any primate by a significant margin, the predicted group size comes out at approximately 150 individuals. Dunbar's number. The apparent cognitive ceiling on stable human social relationships, the number of people whose identities, histories, current situations, and relationship to you a human mind can track and actively maintain. This figure shows up across an extraordinary range of human social contexts. The size of hunter-gatherer bands, the size of functional military units across different armies and periods of history, the size of villages in the Doomsday Book of 11th century England, the average number of people on Christmas card lists in a study conducted decades ago, 150, over and over, in contexts so different from each other that the convergence is difficult to attribute to anything other than something deep in the architecture of the social mind. But what holds 150 relationships together? What is the glue? In other great apes, the answer is physical grooming. picking through another animal's fur, removing parasites, scratching, touching. It sounds primitive, but primate grooming is not just hygiene. It is profoundly social. It triggers the release of endorphins in the groomed animal. It is pleasurable, calming, bonding. It is neurochemically a transaction of trust and alliance maintenance. Watch chimpanzees for long enough and you understand that their social structure, who sits with whom, who grooms whom, which coalitions form and shift, is written in grooming patterns. Dunbar observed something crucial. Great ape species spend approximately 20% of their waking time in social grooming to maintain their social bonds. That figure scales with group size. As groups grow, more grooming time is required to keep the relationships functioning. When Dunbar calculated how much grooming time would be required to maintain all the relationships in a group of 150 humans, the figure came out at approximately 40 to 45% of all waking hours. That is physically impossible. You cannot groom your way through 150 relationships. The math does not work. Dunbar's argument is that language evolved, at least in part, as a solution to this problem. A form of vocal grooming, conversation, shared narrative gossip that could maintain multiple relationships simultaneously. You can tell a story to 5 people at once. You can make all 5 of them feel seen, included, bonded to you and to each other. Manual grooming is always one-to-one. But here is the implication that matters for this chapter. Before language reached that level of sophistication, something else had to be doing part of that work. Something had to maintain cohesion in groups large enough to survive, but too large to groom their way through. Something had to build and reinforce social bonds across people who might not interact directly for days or weeks. Something had to make the group feel, on some level, like a unit rather than a collection of individuals competing for the same resources. The most compelling candidate is shared physical experience, synchronized movement, shared labor, and perhaps most powerfully, shared rhythm. Here is the science that makes this less speculative than it might sound. In 2009, researchers Scott Wiltermuth and Chip Heath published a study that has become quietly influential in cognitive science. They had groups of people walk together around a university campus, some in synchronized step, others not. Afterwards, they measured cooperative behavior in the groups using a series of economic games. The finding was clean and stark. People who had walked in synchrony cooperated more. They trusted each other more. They were more willing to sacrifice individual advantage for collective gain. The effect was not small, and it appeared in multiple replications with different forms of synchronized movement. Walking together, in step, change how people related to each other. Now extend that finding into the deep past. A group of 30 or 50 people engaged in shared physical labor, constructing a shelter, processing game after a hunt, moving camp together across terrain. The bodily synchrony of that shared work was not incidental. It was doing something to the social fabric of the group in real time, binding people together through shared rhythm and shared effort in ways that required no words and no deliberate decision. And then there was fire. The campfire is, among other things, one of the most important social technologies in human evolutionary history. Not just for warmth or cooking or protection from predators, though all of those are real and consequential, but for what it did to the temporal structure of human social life. Before fire, the dark was a limit. Night imposed isolation. Reduced visibility meant reduced activity, meant reduced social engagement. The social day ended when the light did. Fire extended the day. And what happened in those extended hours, around the fire, in the warmth and the shared light, appears to have been qualitatively different from what happened in daylight. Polly Wiesner is an anthropologist who has spent decades working with the Jew/Hoansi, a hunter-gatherer people of southern Africa, whose way of life preserves, in modified form, patterns of social organization with very deep roots. In 2014, she published an analysis of conversations recorded in the community across different times of day. Daytime talk was mostly practical, economic, local grievances, immediate planning, immediate social management, the daily business of group life. Nighttime talk around the fire was different. The content shifted toward stories, toward shared histories, toward accounts of distant places and distant people, toward the kind of narrative that builds a world larger than what could be directly seen. An emotional register shifted too. Laughter increased. A quality of shared imaginative absorption appeared that was essentially absent from the practical exchanges of daylight. The campfire, Wiesner argues, was not just a heat source. It was the original theater, the original shared stage, the context in which something like culture, shared narrative, shared emotional experience, shared imaginative life had the conditions to grow. And in a world before or at the very edge of language, what happened around those fires almost certainly relied far less on words and on everything else. The shared warmth, the shared light in the surrounding dark, the faces of companions visible across the flames, the rhythmic crackle of the fire itself, the physical proximity and the endorphin chemistry that proximity between trusted companions generates. The social mind was being built in that firelight, not with words, with presence. But the social mind was also dealing with problems that pure presence and rhythm could not solve alone. Problems of coordination that required something more structured than shared warmth. Consider a collective hunt, not the opportunistic pursuit of a single animal by a single hunter, a challenging enough cognitive and physical task on its own, but an organized ambush, a group hunt of a herd animal, requiring multiple people to position themselves at specific locations, hold those positions in silence, move at a precisely coordinated moment, and drive the animals toward a kill point where others are waiting. This requires planning. It requires shared understanding of a spatial arrangement that does not yet exist. It requires each participant to know their role, the roles of others, the signal that initiates action, and the contingency plan for when the animals behave unexpectedly. How do you plan this without language? Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer communities have documented several answers, all of which depend on communication systems far richer than most of us have ever consciously noticed. Demonstration. Walking the terrain together. The hunt leader indicates positions through physical placement. Standing here, gesturing there, miming the trajectory of the animals. Knowledge shared not through description, but through enactment in the actual landscape. Gesture. Human gesture, even stripped of language entirely, is compositional, directional, and surprisingly precise. The hand extended, palm down. Fingers together, lowering slowly means something in virtually every human culture. The repeated point, the drawn arc in the air tracing an animal's anticipated path. The open hand pressed flat against the chest indicating stop. These are not language, but they carry information. Shared prior experience. Groups that have hunted together across years and seasons have a library of precedent. They have done versions of this before. They know each other's tendencies, each other's positions, each other's physical capabilities and limitations. The plan does not need to be fully communicated because much of it already exists in shared memory and established pattern. And perhaps most importantly, shared attention. The capacity to jointly focus on the same thing. To know that others are focused on what you're focused on, and to coordinate action from that shared awareness. The pointing finger is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most underrated peculiarities in all of human behavior. Chimpanzees point, but they point instrumentally to request something to indicate what they want. They almost never point declaratively, pointing at something simply to share the experience of it, with no ulterior purpose, just the impulse to say, look at that. The declarative point requires something profound. It requires understanding that another mind can participate in your attentional state, that the experience of seeing something can be communicated, that inner states, perception, interest, wonder, surprise, can be shared. That understanding is a form of theory of mind, and it is ancient. It is prelinguistic. It was operating in human ancestors long before any sophisticated vocal communication, and it was a cognitive foundation on which complex social coordination, and eventually language itself, was built. Because before you can share a word, you have to understand that there is another mind to share it with. The British psychologist Nicholas Humphrey argued in the 1970s that the primary driver of primate brain expansion was not tool use, not environmental complexity, not any feature of the physical world at all. It was the demands of living in a complex, shifting social group, tracking dozens of relationships simultaneously, who owes whom, who has been reliable, who is dangerous, who is an ally of an ally, who is deceptive, who might be persuaded, who should not be trusted, is computationally ferocious. It requires a modeling system of extraordinary sophistication running continuously in the background of every social interaction. Humphrey called it Machiavellian intelligence, the ability to navigate a social world full of beings who are themselves navigating strategically, and all of that intelligence, all of that computational sophistication, all of that exquisitely refined ability to read faces and voices and bodies, and the micro signals of posture, and gaze direction and breathing. All of it was operational. All of it was running in the minds of the people at Blombos, in the minds of the Neanderthals at Krapina and El Sidron, in the minds that hunted and grieved and made jewelry and heated stone and buried their dead and gathered around fires in the dark. Before the word, the social mind was not waiting for language to tell it what to do. It was already doing everything it could with everything it had. It was reading the world through faces. It was building coalitions through rhythm. It was maintaining bonds through shared physical experience. It was transmitting knowledge through presence and demonstration. It was coordinating through gesture and shared attention. It was making something recognizably human, something that would, in time, become the substrate on which language would grow, a whole civilization of the unspoken. And running through all of it, through the planning and the cooperation and the grief and the making of art, was something we have not yet directly asked about, something that might be the most important question of all. Behind all of those behaviors, behind all of that social intelligence and creative capacity and emotional complexity, was there an experience? Was there something it felt like to be those minds? When the person at Blombos pressed a tool into ochre and drew a line, was there an inner sensation of meaning, a felt sense of what they were doing and why? When a Neanderthal laid the body of a companion in a scooped hollow in the earth and placed objects alongside it, was there grief? Not just the behavior of grief, the inner experience of it, the weight of loss pressing against the inside of a chest. Were they conscious? In the way we use that word. In the full first person, here I know the sense of that word. Because that question, the hardest question in this entire documentary, and arguably the hardest question in all of human science, does not have a simple answer, but it has an answer that is more interesting than either yes or no. And to approach it, we have to go somewhere very few documentaries are willing to go, into the nature of consciousness itself, into what it actually is, where it actually comes from, and what, if anything, language has to do with whether something is present inside a mind at all. Here is the central mystery of all philosophy, stated simply enough to feel in your chest. Right now, something is happening. There is a sensation of your eyes moving across this text. There is a quality to the light in the room you are in, or the darkness beyond your screen. There is probably some small ambient sound, traffic or wind, or the distant hum of a building settling into its foundations. There is, beneath all of it, the continuous low-level background of being aware, of being here, of having it inside. That fact, the sheer fact that there is something it feels like to be you right now, is the hardest thing in all of science to explain. Not because we do not know what the brain is doing. Neuroscience can map, with extraordinary precision, the electrical patterns and chemical cascades and neural circuits that correspond to conscious experience. We can track what the brain does when you see red, when you feel fear, when you recognize a face. We can measure it, predict some of it, locate it in tissue with increasing accuracy. What we cannot explain is why any of it feels like anything. Why the neural pattern corresponding to red is accompanied by the sensation of redness. Why the neural cascade corresponding to pain arrives as the experience of suffering rather than as a silent information event in the dark. Why there is an inside at all. Why the brain's processing is not happening in silence, without anyone home to witness it. This is what the philosopher David Chalmers named the hard problem of consciousness. And it is genuinely vertiginously hard. Every other scientific problem, in principle, even if not yet in practice, seems solvable by accumulating enough information about physical systems. But the hard problem resists that approach entirely. No matter how completely you describe the neural correlates of an experience, something seems to be left out. The experience itself, the felt quality, what philosophers call qualia, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain. Why does anything feel like anything? We do not know. And that ignorance is not background noise for this documentary. It is the ground we are standing on. Because if we cannot fully explain why consciousness exists in the brains we understand best, in our own heads, right now, fully equipped with language and self-reflection, then asking whether a mind without language was conscious is not a simple question. It may be the hardest version of the hardest question that exists, but it is not entirely unanswerable. Begin with a case. In the 1980s, a young American woman named Susan Schaller was working as a sign language interpreter when she encountered a man who would change her understanding of a human mind entirely. His name was Ildefonso. He was 27 years old. He had been born deaf in a small Mexican village, and through a combination of poverty, isolation, and a complete absence of educational support, he had grown up without encountering any structured language system whatsoever. Not spoken language, not sign language, not written language, not any symbolic system for encoding and transmitting meaning between minds. He had lived 27 years inside a fully modern human brain, anatomically indistinguishable from yours. Without language, Schaller began working with him. Patiently, across weeks, she taught him sign language. And as that capacity slowly assembled itself, as the structure of a symbol system finally arrived in a mind that had been waiting for it across an entire lifetime, she asked him about what the world had been like inside his mind in all the years without language. What Ildefonso described was not nothing. It was not an empty room. He described a world of intense perceptual vividness, a world in which faces and objects and events arrived with a clarity that was almost overwhelming, because there was no verbal layer standing between him and the thing itself, no name that abstracted the particular into a category. A face was not the concept of a face. It was a full, specific, irreducible thing, its qualities of light and movement and emotional expression arriving directly, unfiltered, without being processed first through language's sorting machinery. He described planning, not as sentences, but as something more like mental film. Sequences of images of himself doing things, of outcomes he anticipated, of obstacles he imagined navigating. The plan had no narrative structure, no verbal if-then logic, but it was there. It operated. It guided action. He described social relationships tracked through what he could only later name as felt familiarity, something between sensation and knowledge, a quality attached to particular people, particular faces, that encoded trust or danger or warmth without articulating any of those things. An emotional fingerprint for each person in his world, carried in the body as much as in the mind. And he described emotion itself, not the concept of emotions, not sadness or fear or longing as named and categorized states, but the raw, unnamed conditions, something pressing outward from the inside of his chest, something that rose and changed and settled, unnarrated, uncategorized, but fully, completely present. What Ildefonso had before language was not emptiness. It was a different kind of fullness, a fullness without edges, without the category boundaries that language draws around experience, without the temporal scaffolding that narrative provides for the self moving through time, without the internal monologue that comments on what is happening and relates it to what happened before, but fullness nonetheless. And when language finally arrived, when the structure assembled and the world of symbols opened, his first response was not joy. He told Schaller later that the initial experience was shattering, because with language came something new and terrible. The past. The ability to look backwards across 27 years and know, for the first time with the clarity that language provides, what had been missing. To encounter the gap between what he had been and what he was now, with a precision that his pre-linguistic mind had never been able to construct. Grief, with a word for it, is a different thing from grief without one. He cried for a week. Ildefonso is not a direct analog for the minds of Blombos. He is a modern human, living in a world saturated with language that he could not access, but was nonetheless immersed in, surrounded by spoken conversation he could not decode, by printed text everywhere he looked. His brain was shaped by inputs that simply do not exist for any human who lived before language was part of the world at all. The parallel is imperfect, but his account remains the closest thing we have. The nearest first-person testimony from inside a fully modern human mind operating without language. And what it describes is consciousness. unambiguously, demonstrably, richly, consciousness. Now here's a neuroscience that supports this inference beyond any single testimony. Aphasia. It is a spectrum of language disorders caused by brain damage, stroke, injury, tumor, that can selectively impair or destroy the capacity for language, while leaving much of the rest of cognition intact. There are people living with severe aphasia right now who have lost the ability to produce fluent speech, who cannot reliably name common objects, who cannot follow complex verbal instructions, and who are unmistakably, evidently conscious. They grieve, they form preferences, they display humor and affection and frustration. They navigate social relationships with sensitivity and adjust to the emotional states of people around them. They recognize faces and retain knowledge of places and events. They act and adjust when action fails, and persist when persistence is warranted. They have lost language. They have not lost awareness. They have not lost a sense of being present, of mattering to themselves, of caring about what happens next. Antonio Damasio, one of the most consequential neuroscientists of the past half-century, has spent his career building a framework around exactly this distinction. He draws a careful line between what he calls core consciousness and extended consciousness. Core consciousness is the basic biological fact of subjectivity, the moment-by-moment sense of being a self having an experience. It does not require language. It does not require episodic memory or the capacity to narrate a life. It is present in organisms with far simpler brains than ours, present in animals that no one disputes have some form of inner experience. It is present in human infants before language acquisition begins. It is present intact in patients with profound amnesia who form no new lasting memories and cannot tell you what happened 5 minutes ago, but who are unmistakably, inarguably there, present, responsive, alive to the moment in every way that matters. Core consciousness runs on ancient neuromachinery, the brainstem, the subcortical structures, architecture that evolution built long before the cortex expanded to its current extraordinary size. It is not a luxury of intelligent brains. It is something closer to a basic feature of biological life operating above a certain threshold of complexity. Extended consciousness is built on top of that foundation, and it is here that language becomes transformative. Extended consciousness is a full autobiographical self. The self that moves through time, that can remember and anticipate, that can reflect on its own states from a position of slight distance, that constructs and maintains a narrative of who it is, and where it came from, and what it is heading toward. It is the consciousness that knows it is conscious, the self-awareness that can turn inward and find history. This form of consciousness is not exclusively human. There is evidence that other animals have meaningful aspects of it, but language elaborates it almost beyond recognition. It is the difference between existing in time and narrating your existence through time, between having a life and being able to tell yourself the story of one. What follows from this distinction is both humbling and clarifying. The minds at Blombos almost certainly had core consciousness, something it was like to be them, a felt sense of presence, emotional states that were real and weighted and consequential, social perceptions of extraordinary refinement, built by millions of years of primate evolution running on neural architecture, selected specifically for reading other minds, physical sensations anchored in a landscape they knew with an intimacy that no modern human will ever recover. The question of extended consciousness, the full autobiographical self, the narrative identity, the experience of being a self moving through remembered past toward an imagined future, depends on questions about their communication systems and cognitive architecture that remain genuinely unresolved. But here is something worth sitting with carefully. Even now, among fully language-equipped modern humans, the inner experience of consciousness is not uniformly verbal. Research into what cognitive scientists call inner speech, the internal monologue, the voice in the head that narrates, has found that a substantial portion of people do not experience thought primarily as internal narration. Some people think predominantly in images, in spatial patterns, in something felt rather than articulated. They are not less intelligent for it. They are not less conscious. They are differently organized inside. When they speak or write, they are not reporting a pre-existing verbal thought. They are translating something nonverbal into verbal form, building language over a foundation that was already there in a different register. Even now, Even in us, consciousness is not reducible to language. It runs below language and around it, and sometimes in directions that language cannot follow. Take that observation back 77,000 years. Back to a mind that had, perhaps, rich emotional vocalizations, perhaps subtle, context-dependent, socially sophisticated sounds that carried meaning without yet having the full recursive structure language. A mind in which the nonverbal substrate that in modern humans underlies language was a primary stage, the whole of what there was. What would that feel like? If Ildefonso's account is any guide, and it remains the best guide we have, it would feel like intensity, like the world arriving without the buffer of categorization, like emotion that has no name and therefore no distance from itself. No label that slightly separates you from what you're feeling by placing it in a known category, like planning that is seen and felt rather than spoken to oneself, like social reality experience as a rich field of presences rather than as a cast of named characters in a mental story. It would not feel like nothing. It would not feel like the inside of a cave with no fire. It might feel like a fire with no cave. Vast, luminous, immediate, and perhaps, in its lack of edges, in its absence of the boundaries language draws, terrify in a way that has no name for itself. Were the people at Blombos conscious? Yes, almost certainly. In the core sense, in the sense that matters most and is hardest to explain. Yes. Were they conscious as we are? No, almost certainly not. Were they conscious in a way that was sufficient to grieve, to feel the pull of beauty, to want with urgency and intention to mark a piece of red stone with lines that carried meaning, even if neither they nor we can fully say what that meaning was? The evidence says yes. And that answer, careful, hedged, earned slowly through genetics and archaeology and neuroscience, and the testimony of man who cried for a week when language finally arrived, is one of the most important things this story has to offer, because it dismantles a hierarchy we have quietly imposed. The ranking of minds by their proximity to our current form, the assumption that to be fully human requires being human in the way we happen to be right now. They were human, completely, in every sense that the word can mean something deeper than anatomy, which makes what happened next not a story creation, not a moment of ignition where consciousness finally switched on and humanity truly began, but something more complicated, more ambivalent, more honest than that, because language, when it arrived, whenever it arrived, however it arrived, did not make these minds real. It made them different, and in some ways, in ways that are rarely acknowledged, in ways that may be genuinely difficult to look at directly. It may have taken something away, even as it gave something that had never existed before anywhere in the history of life on Earth. What changed when the word came is the final question this story has to answer, and it is not the triumphant story we have always assumed it was. For most of the 20th century, there was a story, a clean story, a satisfying story, the kind of story that arrives with the authority of consensus and the comfort of clarity. It went like this. For most of human prehistory, our ancestors were capable but limited, biologically modern, perhaps anatomically ready, but cognitively constrained, living in a kind of permanent present, unable to fully symbolize, unable to plan deeply across time, unable to build knowledge that accumulated across generations faster than it was lost. They were, in this telling, a species waiting at the edge of something without the key to get through the door. Then approximately 50,000 years ago, something happened. Something sudden. Perhaps a genetic mutation in a regulatory gene. Perhaps a critical threshold of neural complexity finally crossed. Whatever the trigger, the effect was dramatic and swift and total. In the space of a few thousand years, a heartbeat in geological time, the archaeological record transformed. Cave paintings appeared across Europe. Figurines carved from ivory. Musical instruments. Long-distance trade of rare materials. Elaborate burial goods. Fishing hooks and needles. An explosion of behavioral complexity so concentrated and so dramatic that researchers called it the creative revolution. The great leap forward. The moment humanity finally became itself. The story was compelling. It mapped neatly onto the European archaeological record. It had a satisfying shape, a long, flat period and then a spike, a before and an after. It was wrong, not entirely. The European record is real. The explosion of complex behavior in Europe around 40 to 50,000 years ago is genuine. But what the story missed, what decades of African archaeology have gradually and irrefutably demonstrated, is that the explosion in Europe was not the beginning. The shell beads of Blombos predate it by 30,000 years. The ochre engravings predate it. The compound ochre toolkits predate it. The heat-treated silkcrete predate it. The Neanderthal eagle talons in Croatia predate it by 80,000 years. The pigmented shells in Spain predate it by 70,000 years. What exploded in Europe was not the emergence of symbolic cognition. It was the arrival in Europe of people who already had it. People coming from Africa carry with them capacities that have been developing fitfully and unevenly across a much longer and more complex process than anyone initially recognized. The story was never a switch. It was always a slow fire, but a fire that, somewhere in that long middle period, somewhere in the tens of thousands of years between the first ochre engravings and the painted caves of France, crossed a threshold that researchers believe, with increasing confidence, was connected to the full emergence of something the pre-linguistic mind had only been approaching: recursive language, syntax, the ability to embed thoughts inside other thoughts, to build propositions of unlimited complexity from a finite set of sounds, to talk about what is not present, what never happened, and what might yet be. The linguist Noam Chomsky has argued that the essential cognitive innovation of language is recursion, the capacity to take a complete thought and insert it inside another complete thought, generating structures of indefinite complexity. The man who saw the animal that ate the fish that came from the river that runs through the valley where the shelter stands through the winter. That chain of embedded clauses, each one a complete thought absorbed into a larger thought, is structurally impossible to communicate through gesture alone, through emotional vocalization alone, through shared attention alone. It requires syntax. It requires the combinatorial machinery of language. And what that machinery makes possible is something that had never existed anywhere in the history of life on Earth before it appeared in the human mind: displacement, the capacity to speak of what is not here, of what was, of what will be, of what might be, of what should be, of what could have been if something else had happened first. Before full language, communication is anchored to the present, to the thing in front of you, to the immediate social situation. The emotional call that warns of danger is about the danger now. The gesture that coordinates a hunt is about this hunt on this terrain, today. Even the most sophisticated pre-linguistic communication is weighted with the gravity of the present moment. It is hard, perhaps impossible, to pull it loose from what is actually happening and carry it into pure abstraction. Language severs that anchor. With language, you can stand by a river and tell your companion what the river was like 3 seasons ago when the fish were running thick, and why it matters for where they should look tomorrow, and what your father once told you about the years when the river ran differently, and what that might mean for this winter if the rains hold. A thread of information moving freely through time, backward into memory, forward into anticipation, sideways into inference, carried in words between two minds standing in the present. This is what changed everything. Not because it created intelligence. The intelligence was already there, but because it created the capacity to accumulate intelligence across time in a form that survives the death of the person who generated it. Once you can describe what you know in language, someone else can carry that description into a future you will never see. They can add to it, refine it, pass it further. The knowledge does not die with its keeper. It escapes the body that held it and moves forward through generations, building on itself, ratcheting upward in complexity and precision in ways that any single mind's lifespan makes otherwise impossible. This is what researchers call cumulative cultural evolution, the ratchet, and it appears to be the specific feature of human cultural life that no other species has achieved in any comparable form. Each generation of chimpanzees essentially relearns everything from scratch. The tools, the behaviors, the social patterns. They are transmitted imperfectly through direct observation, but they do not reliably build on themselves across time. The ratchet slips. The accumulated complexity bleeds back toward a baseline. Human culture with language does not slip. It climbs. In 10,000 years of agriculture and writing and accumulated technical knowledge, we went from stone tools to spacecraft. The acceleration is not because modern humans are smarter than the people at Blombos. It is because we have a technology, languages, external storage extensions, writing and recording, that allows knowledge to accumulate at a rate that biological evolution cannot match, and that pre-linguistic cultural transmission could only approach glacially. Language also did something to social organization that may matter as much as anything it did for technology. It made it possible to coordinate with strangers. In a world without language, or with only its earliest forms, trust is built through direct experience, through repeated interaction, through shared physical history, through the embodied knowledge of specific people gained across time. You can trust the people you know. You can extend that trust cautiously to people vouched for by people you know. But building real cooperation beyond the circle of direct acquaintance requires something language alone can provide: shared belief. If two strangers can share a story about who they are, where they come from, what they owe each other, what power governs them both, what happens after death, then they have a basis for cooperation that does not require prior personal history. They share a cognitive world. They inhabit the same imagined landscape of meaning. The writer Yuval Noah Harari calls this the cognitive revolution, the emergence of the ability to believe in things that exist only as shared mental constructs. Gods, nations, laws, money, debt, honor, sacred places. These are not physical realities. They are agreements, extraordinarily powerful agreements, maintained by shared language and shared narrative, that allow millions of people who have never met to coordinate their behavior toward common ends. Harari's argument is deliberately provocative, but the core insight stands. Language did not just change what individuals could think, it changed what groups could be. It made possible a form of collective intelligence, a shared cognitive space extending far beyond 150 people any single mind can track. That simply has no precedent in any other species. Not even close. And somewhere in the long, uneven mosaic process by which all of this developed, somewhere between the first ochre engravings and the first fully syntactic language, someone spoke the first word that functioned as a word in the full sense. What was it? We cannot know. We will never know. But we can reason about what it was probably like. Linguists who study language origins tend to agree that the first units of meaningful vocal communication were probably not the clean, context-free symbols that mature language runs on. They were more likely what some researchers call emotionally anchored calls, sounds that were already attached to emotional and social contexts, that carried feeling as much as information, that meant something because of what was happening when they were produced rather than by convention alone. Not the abstract word fire, carrying its meaning anywhere regardless of context, but something more like the sound made in the presence of fire, shaped by fear or warmth or urgency, already recognizable companions who shared that context, beginning its long journey toward the abstraction that language requires. The first words were probably born soaking in the situation they described. It took time, a great deal of time, for them to dry out, to become fully portable, to detach from the present moment, and become tools that could carry meaning across time. But here is what that transition required. Not more intelligence, more abstraction, a slight and crucial loosening of the grip that the present exerts on communication, the ability to produce the sound for fire when there is no fire, when you are describing what happened yesterday, or warning about what might happen tomorrow. That loosening multiplied across a vocabulary, across generations of refinement and convention, across the pressures of social life demanding ever more precise and displaced communication, is where language comes from. Not from a single mutation, not from a single day, from accumulation. The same process that built the hand axe tradition now applied to sound. And when it was fully in place, when syntax was established and displacement was reliable and the ratchet of cumulative culture was turning, the world changed in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. In a few dozen millennia, we went from shell beads to cities, from ochre engravings to written law codes, from shared campfires to shared religions governing millions. All of it built on the foundation of the wordless minds who came before. And yet, there is a counterweight to hold here. Because every gain in human cognitive history has been a trade, and the emergence of language was not exempt from that law. What Ildefonso described, that overwhelming sensory directness, that unmediated arrival of the world, is not entirely available to a language-equipped mind. The verbal layer interposes itself. When you see a tree, the word arrives almost simultaneously with the perception. The category is already there before a particular thing fully lands. The name creates a slight, almost invisible distance between you and the experience of seeing, because the name belongs to general, to the type, and the thing in front of you is always specific, always irreducibly itself. This is not lost in any simple sense. Categorization is the foundation of practical intelligence. Without categories, knowledge cannot accumulate. Without names, nothing can be transmitted. The trade was overwhelmingly worth making. But something is there in that distance between name and thing, in that instant of categorization that runs faster than awareness. Ancient contemplative traditions across the world have noticed it and built entire practices around the attempt to recover what lies on the other side of it, the thing before the word, the experience before the label. Some of the most intense creative and spiritual experiences that people report involve precisely the sensation of the category dropping away, the sudden, startling arrival of the thing itself, as if the mind had momentarily slipped its verbal architecture. The people at Blombos did not need to seek that experience. It was all they had. Their consciousness ran on what we have had to work deliberately to find our way back to, a world of particulars rather than categories, of presences rather than concepts, of immediate felt, embodied meaning rather than symbolic, deferred, transmitted meaning, different from us, not lesser than us, just on the other side of the most consequential threshold in the entire history of human thought. And standing at that threshold, looking back at the long silence and forward at everything language unleashed, we are left with one final question, not about what the prelinguistic world was, and not about what language created, but about what it all means, for who we are, for what we are still carrying without knowing it, from those 200,000 years of wordless thought, for what the ochre engraving at Blombos is still saying to us, across 77,000 years of silence. If we can learn to hear it, come back to the cave, come back to the coastline in the cold light, the wind off the Benguela current, the limestone cliff face above the sea, come back to the small opening in the rock, 15 meters above where the waves are breaking, looking out over an ocean that has no name yet in any language that will survive. Come back to the person. They are holding the ochre, the flat, smooth, ground face of it resting against their fingers, the pointed tool in their other hand, and they are making lines. We have spent this entire documentary walking toward this moment, through the genetics and the archaeology and the neuroscience and the philosophy, through the Neanderthal burials and the eagle talons and the campfires and the wordless hunts, through the testimony of man who cried for a week when language finally arrived in his mind, through the hard problem of consciousness and the ratchet of cumulative culture and the moment, whenever it was, when the first sound dried out enough to become a word. We have walked all of that distance, and we are back here, at this person, at this stone, at these lines. And what has changed is not the mystery. The mystery is intact. We still cannot say with certainty what the pattern meant. We still cannot reach across 77,000 years and know what was happening inside that mind while those hands moved. The silence is still there. It is not smaller for everything we have learned, but we are standing in it differently now. We know that the mind behind those hands was conscious, not in the identical way we are conscious, not narrated, not autobiographical in the full language-equipped sense, not running the internal monologue that has become so habitual in us that we have mistaken it for thought itself, but conscious in the core sense, present, aware. There was something it was like to be that person, in that cave, on that morning. The world arrived for them. It weighed something. It mattered. We know the social world they lived in was rich beyond what we once imagined, held together by rhythm and presence and shared attention, and the sophisticated, wordless reading of faces and bodies that still runs in us now, below language, as the ancient foundation on which everything we have built is resting. We know their tools encoded planning and abstraction, and a deep, embodied intelligence that operated without a single word, that was already extraordinary long before language came to transform it into something else. We know that some of their DNA is inside us, that the people who lived in the cold north alongside our ancestors left a trace in our genomes that is still present, still functional, still shaping aspect of our immune systems and our biology in ways researchers are only beginning to map. They are not entirely gone. They never were. And we know, this may be the most important thing, that the person at Blombos was not primitive, was not waiting, was not a lesser version of something that would later become real. They were real, completely, fully, irreducibly real. Thinking, feeling, creating, meaning something by what they made, even if the meaning lived in a register we no longer have direct access to. Here is what still cannot be answered, and must not be answered falsely. We do not know what the pattern meant to them. That is not a small admission. That is the center of the whole story. The ochre engraving survives. The mind that made it does not. And no archaeology, however careful, no genetics, however precise, no neuroscience, however sophisticated, can cross that particular distance. Between the object and the experience that produced it, there is a gap that may never be bridged. It is not a failure of method. It is a property of consciousness itself. The same property that makes your inner experience inaccessible to anyone who is not you, even now, even with all the language in the world to try to convey it. The person at Blombos could not have told us, even if we had been there, not because they lacked the capacity for meaning, but because meaning at that depth, the felt sense of why a particular mark on a particular stone mattered on a particular morning, has always been larger than any language made to carry it. We share that condition with them. Whatever our inner experience is, it exceeds our ability to fully transmit it. Language gets us closer than the ochre engraving does, but it does not get us all the way. The felt inside of being alive, in you, right now, is yours alone and will end with you, and will leave only its traces in the objects and the stories and the marks you leave behind for minds that will never fully know what it was like. We are all, in that sense, carving lines into ochre, trying to mean something, reaching across a silence that cannot be fully crossed, leaving a mark on the world with the full weight of an inner life that the world cannot quite contain. The extraordinary thing is not the gap between that ancient person and us. The extraordinary thing is how much was already there before the word arrived, close it, or to open it further, depending on how you look. 200,000 years of thought without language. 200,000 years of grief and planning and beauty and connection and meaning. All of it happening in the dark, in the firelight, on coastlines and hillsides and cave floors, in minds that were already fully human and already fully present and already reaching, always reaching, towards something they could sense but perhaps not say. That reaching is the oldest human gesture there is. We are still making it. The lines are still there on the ochre in the cave above the sea. And somewhere in the wordless place inside you, below the language, where the feeling lives before it finds its name, you already know what they mean.